Imagine losing everything in a single day. A day that started like any other, where you went about your routine, never suspecting that today would be the day everything changed. Now, imagine waking up and realizing, you can't find the people you love. You're surrounded by empty rooms, unanswered questions, and a creeping sense that something terrible has happened. And the only clue you have is a single name, a name that means more than you realize. This isn't just any ordinary mystery. This is the story of manipulation, lies, and a professor who used his power to control everything, everyone, around him. His students were nothing more than pawns, and it's only now, after years of secrecy, that the truth is finally coming to light. But what if I told you the key to finding them, the last of the missing, was hidden in a forgotten warehouse, far from the watchful eyes of the world? In the shadows of a prestigious university, one professor's hidden past stretches back decades, a web of manipulation, secrets, and disappearances that no one saw coming. 3 students. Gone without a trace. And now, Detective Lena Ortiz has uncovered the chilling truth. Professor Hammond didn't just teach, he controlled. He played his students like pawns in a deadly game. But what if one last piece of the puzzle, hidden in a forgotten warehouse, holds the key to ending it all? Where did Lucas Carter disappear to? The answer lies just beyond the door, and it's more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. In the heart of Brookside University, nestled among ivy-covered buildings and tree-lined paths, trust had always been the cornerstone of student life. Professors were mentors, guiding their students through both academic and personal growth. The campus buzzed with youthful energy, late-night study sessions, and discussions that shaped future careers. But behind this idyllic academic environment, a shadow was growing, a shadow that would cast doubt on everything. Lucas Carter, a 20-year-old college student studying history, was everything one would expect from an earnest young adult. Eager to learn, passionate about his studies, and friendly to those around him, Lucas was a familiar face in the halls of Brookside. His professors liked him, and his classmates trusted him. But one morning in late October, Lucas didn't show up for class. And just like that, the trust that had defined Brookside began to fracture. Lucas was a creature of habit. He walked the same path every day from his apartment to the university's main quad. His routine was simple, predictable. He had no reason to fear for his safety. That's why no one suspected anything was wrong when he didn't return home the night he went missing. It was only after several missed classes and unanswered calls that the whispers began. Lucas was missing. The campus, once full of light-hearted chatter and footsteps, was now haunted by an unsettling silence. His disappearance wasn't just a local issue, it shook the very foundation of the university. Detective Lena Ortiz, an investigator with years of experience in the cold cases unit, was assigned to the case. Ortiz wasn't familiar with the tight-knit world of academia, but the disappearance of Lucas Carter struck a personal chord with her. As a former college student herself, she knew how isolating the pressures of academic life could be. But this wasn't just another missing person case, it was the kind that felt off from the very beginning. Ortiz reviewed the facts of the case. Lucas was last seen on campus at 2:30 p.m. in Professor Elliot Hammond's office. Lucas had been struggling with a difficult history paper, and Hammond, a respected but intimidating lecturer, had agreed to meet with him after class to discuss it. It was a small interaction, one that seemed unremarkable at first. But when Ortiz dug deeper, she realized the significance of that meeting. Hammond had been the last person to see Lucas alive. Ortiz's investigation led her into the labyrinth of university politics and the relationship between professor and student. Hammond, a man in his mid-40s, was known for his brilliant lectures but also for his dark, cryptic nature. There were whispers around campus about his unconventional methods and his past relationships with students, some of which bordered on inappropriate. But no one could ever confirm anything beyond hearsay. Ortiz needed to speak with Hammond. She made her way to the office of Professor Hammond, located in a quieter, older part of the campus that felt strangely detached from the bustling energy of the main quad. The office was a reflection of its owner, dark wood, shelves lined with thick, old books, and dim lighting that gave it an almost gothic feel. Professor Hammond's office door was slightly ajar when Ortiz knocked, and when he invited her in, she immediately noticed something unsettling about his demeanor. He was calm, too calm, considering the gravity of the situation. He greeted her with the air of someone who had nothing to hide, yet there was something in his eyes that made Ortiz pause. "Detective Ortiz, how can I help you?" Hammond's voice was smooth, but it carried an edge of something more sinister, an unspoken tension that wasn't lost on the detective. Ortiz began with the usual questions, asking about Lucas' behavior, his interactions with the professor, and if Hammond had seen anything unusual the day Lucas disappeared. Hammond's answers were measured, polite, and without a hint of concern. He stated that Lucas had left his office around 3 p.m., looking agitated but not distressed. Hammond claimed he hadn't thought much of it. After all, students were often stressed at this time of year, preparing for finals and juggling assignments. But Ortiz noticed a crack in his calmness. When she asked about the specific nature of their conversation, Hammond's story seemed rehearsed. It was as if he was withholding something important. Ortiz felt a shiver down her spine. She knew something wasn't right. The more Hammond spoke, the more Ortiz realized how carefully he had crafted his alibi. Hammond had been in his office alone after 3 p.m., and Lucas was the last student to visit him that day. It was an isolated space, one with no security cameras, making it the perfect location for something to happen without witnesses. Ortiz's suspicion grew, but she needed more. She needed hard evidence. The breakthrough came when Ortiz learned that the security footage from the building was mysteriously erased for that afternoon. Hammond had claimed it was a glitch, but Ortiz didn't buy it. She knew it wasn't a coincidence. In an effort to trace Lucas's last movements, Ortiz began interviewing Lucas' friends and roommates. They all painted a picture of a young man who was increasingly distant in the days leading up to his disappearance. Lucas had been uneasy, stressed about his academic future, and seemed to be withdrawing from those around him. He had been spending more time in Hammond's office than usual, something that had caught the attention of his friends. But what was more troubling was Lucas' recent behavior regarding his grades. He had failed to meet Hammond's expectations on an early paper and had been called into the office multiple times to discuss his performance. Was it academic pressure? Or was there something darker at play? Ortiz found herself combing through old emails between Lucas and Hammond. One email in particular caught her attention. It was a late-night message from Lucas asking Hammond for help with his grade, suggesting that he had been pushed into a corner. The tone was desperate, and Ortiz could see why. Lucas was a good student, but his grades were slipping, and Hammond had the power to control his academic future. But there was one thing that disturbed Ortiz even more, a line in the email that read, "I'll do whatever it takes to pass." Ortiz's phone buzzed. It was the lab results for the forensic analysis of Lucas's phone. The results were clear. A text message had been sent from Lucas' phone after he left Hammond's office. The message was sent to an unknown number, and the contents were chilling. "I'm in over my head. I need out. Please help." The timestamp was 3:45 p.m., 45 minutes after Hammond had said Lucas left the office. Ortiz's pulse quickened. She now had the proof she needed. Lucas was still alive after leaving Hammond's office. But what had happened to him in that half hour? Where had he gone, and who had helped him? Ortiz knew she was getting closer. But the truth, whatever it was slipping through her fingers, and she had only a few precious hours before the next twist in this case would unfold. Lena Ortiz sat in her car, parked in front of the university's main building, the evening light fading around her like a curtain being pulled shut. The day had left her feeling restless. She had the proof. Lucas Carter had been alive long after he was supposed to have left Professor Hammond's office. Yet, the question still lingered in her mind. Where had he gone? And who had been involved in his disappearance? The lab results from Lucas's phone had given Ortiz more than she'd bargained for. The message sent from Lucas's phone was chilling, but it was also vague. Who had Lucas reached out to? What was he really in over his head with? She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a case of academic pressure or some misguided affair between student and professor. There was something far darker at play, something bigger than either Lucas or Hammond. Ortiz Ortiz's mind raced as she replayed the details. Hammond's demeanor during their meeting had been too calm, too rehearsed. The man had been hiding something, she was certain of it now. But Hammond wasn't the only one with a dark past. She knew there were shadows lurking all over Brookside University, and she was about to uncover them. Ortiz clicked open the file she had prepared on Hammond. She had already visited the university's archives earlier that day, digging through old records and finding nothing that would have raised any alarms about the professor's background. Everything appeared spotless until she turned her focus to his personal history. Back in 1995, before Hammond had arrived at Brookside University, he had been a faculty member at a small liberal arts college in a neighboring town. His records there were sealed under the guise of personal privacy. But Ortiz wasn't convinced. If there was something hidden in his past, this was where it would have been buried. She grabbed her phone and made a call to an old colleague in law enforcement. It was time to dig deeper. Ortiz's colleague, Detective Roger Hunt, had been part of the department for over 20 years. He was the kind of guy who didn't take shortcuts, who wasn't afraid to make enemies if it meant getting the job done right. The connection between them went back years, and he owed her a favor. When Ortiz explained what she needed, he promised to get back to her with information from the 1995 files. In the meantime, Ortiz turned her attention back to Hammond. She'd spent hours combing through his online presence. Nothing unusual stood out. He had no social media accounts, no personal website, and his academic history was spotless. It was almost too perfect. That's when she remembered something, a former student, someone who had been one of Hammond's brightest pupils a few years ago. His name was Daniel Grant. He had been something of a prodigy in history, until he'd left the university abruptly. Ortiz knew this was the lead she needed. A conversation with Daniel Grant could offer more insight into Hammond's behavior and give her the final pieces of the puzzle. She tracked down Daniel's contact information and arranged to meet him that evening at a cafe downtown. The cafe was dimly lit, with small, cozy booths along the back wall. Ortiz arrived first, taking a seat by the window, watching as the rain began to fall in heavy sheets outside. The city lights reflected off the wet pavement, casting an eerie glow inside. She didn't have long to wait before Daniel Grant walked in. He was taller than she remembered, his sharp features now framed by the weight of years spent away from Brookside. His dark hair was longer than in his college days, and his eyes, once bright with youthful ambition, were now clouded with something that looked like regret or fear. "Detective Ortiz," Daniel said, his voice low and cautious. "I wasn't expecting to see you again." Ortiz motioned for him to sit. "I know this isn't easy, Daniel. I need to talk to you about your former professor, Elliot Hammond." Daniel stiffened slightly, but he didn't look away. "What about him?" "Something happened to one of his students, Lucas Carter. He went missing a few days ago, and Hammond's name keeps coming up. You're one of his former students, right? You were a bright one. What can you tell me about him?" Daniel hesitated. His eyes darted toward the door, as though he was searching for an escape. "Hammond is complicated," he said slowly. He was one of those professors who had this power over students. He was the kind of guy you wanted to impress, but it was never enough. Always just out of reach. Ortiz leaned forward. "What do you mean by out of reach?" Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. "Hammond had this hold on you, you know. He made you feel like you owed him something. Like you couldn't succeed without his help. I never saw it for what it was back then. But looking back, I think he used students like me, used our ambitions to control us." Ortiz's mind raced. Did he ever do anything inappropriate? Anything you felt was wrong? Daniel's face darkened. "You have no idea. I didn't realize it until after I left. But Hammond, he wasn't just about teaching. He had a way of getting too close. He knew how to make you feel like you were the only one who mattered to him." Ortiz felt a chill crawl down her spine. "Is that why you left?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Yeah. I couldn't deal with it anymore. I had to get out of there. But it wasn't just me. I'm not the only one who left under strange circumstances. I know there were others. But no one ever spoke up. He made sure of that. Ortiz's mind was racing. She had heard enough. Hammond's manipulative behavior wasn't just an isolated incident. He had built an empire of control, and Lucas Carter had walked right into it. Before she could press for more, Daniel stood up, his face pale. You need to be careful, detective. The deeper you go, the more dangerous this becomes. I'm telling you this because I know what it's like to feel trapped by him. Ortiz watched as Daniel quickly walked out of the cafe, leaving her with more questions than answers. But she now knew something important. Lucas was just the latest in a long line of victims. Hammond's influence reached far beyond the classroom, and Ortiz was getting closer to uncovering the terrifying truth. Ortiz's phone buzzed. It was Roger Hunt. He had the files from 1995. Ortiz, you were right, Roger said, his voice grim. Hammond's history is far darker than we thought. He wasn't just involved with one student. He was connected to a string of disappearances over the years. It looks like Lucas Carter isn't the first. Ortiz's blood ran cold. What do you mean? Roger hesitated, then continued. I found evidence linking Hammond to a case in 1995. A student named Rachel Turner. She went missing, just like Lucas. And guess who was the last person to see her? Ortiz felt a rush of dread. Let me guess, Elliot Hammond. Roger's voice was barely a whisper. It gets worse. Rachel Turner wasn't the only one. There were others, all students of Hammond's. But none of them were ever found. Ortiz's heart raced. The truth was darker than she could have ever imagined. But now, she had a name, Rachel Turner, and she was going to find out what happened to her. The past was catching up to the present, and Hammond's web of lies was about to unravel. The next morning, Detective Ortiz's office was a mess of papers, files, and coffee cups. The case had consumed her. She had barely slept, and the burning question of why had kept her up the entire night. The pieces were starting to come together, but they didn't make sense. How could Professor Elliot Hammond, a man who had been trusted by an entire community, be connected to so many disappearances over the years? Ortiz couldn't shake the image of Daniel Grant's face when he spoke about Hammond's hold over his students. It had been a subtle kind of control, one that preyed on their vulnerabilities, their desire for approval. What if Lucas had gotten too close? What if, like Rachel Turner, he had become another pawn in Hammond's twisted game? She picked up the phone and dialed the number she had written down last night. It was time to visit Rachel Turner's parents. Ortiz wasn't sure what she would find, but she knew it was important. Rachel Turner had vanished nearly 15 years ago, and the case had been quietly buried. What if her disappearance held the key to unraveling this entire mystery? She set the phone down with a heavy sigh and grabbed her coat. The rain outside had intensified, the streets slick and dark. It felt fitting, a storm was brewing, and Ortiz could feel the weight of the storm's arrival. Rachel Turner's parents lived in a modest house on the outskirts of Brookside, tucked away from the bustling university district. When Ortiz arrived, she was greeted by Mrs. Turner, a fragile woman in her late 50s, her face lined with the years of grief she had carried since Rachel's disappearance. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, now looked hollow, as though the hope of seeing her daughter again had long since faded. Detective Ortiz, I wasn't expecting, Mrs. Turner's voice trailed off as she stepped aside to let Ortiz in. It's been so long since anyone's asked about Rachel. We've almost forgotten what it was like before. Ortiz followed her inside, the smell of old wood and dust filling the air. The living room was filled with family photos, most of them centered around Rachel, her smiling face frozen in time. Ortiz could see it, Rachel had been young, vibrant, and full of promise. I'm sorry to bring up painful memories, but I need to ask you about Rachel, Ortiz began. I know it's been years, but the truth is, I believe there's a connection between your daughter and a recent case I'm working on. I'm trying to understand why Rachel disappeared. Mrs. Turner's hand trembled as she poured Ortiz a cup of coffee, then sat down beside her. I've told the police everything I know. Rachel went missing after a meeting with her history professor. It wasn't anything strange at first. She came home that afternoon, upset because she had received a low grade on a paper she worked hard on. But she wasn't the kind of student to just give up. She went back to school for some extra help with the professor. That was the last time we saw her. Ortiz's gut twisted. She knew the next question was the one that would tie this all together, but she had to ask it anyway. Do you remember the name of her professor? Was it someone by the name of Elliot Hammond? Mrs. Turner's face stiffened. Yes, it was him. She mentioned him a few times. A good teacher, very focused on his students, very kind. But, Mrs. Turner faltered, her voice cracking. But I remember Rachel was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with him. She didn't tell me everything, but I could see it in her eyes. She started avoiding the professor, and that's when she became distant. I never questioned it at the time. I didn't think much of it. Ortiz's heart sank. This wasn't just an isolated incident. Rachel Turner had known something, felt something, before her disappearance. Hammond's grip on his students wasn't new. Did Rachel ever say anything specific about him? Anything that might have warned you? Ortiz pressed. Mrs. Turner shook her head, eyes filling with tears. I wish I had known. I wish I had seen the signs. Ortiz placed the empty cup down, feeling the weight of what she was uncovering. I believe Rachel may have known something about Professor Hammond's darker side. And I think Lucas Carter may have been caught in the same trap. The conversation with Rachel's mother had confirmed what Ortiz feared. Hammond had been using his position for more than just teaching. He had manipulated his students, controlled them, and when they became too difficult to control, he discarded them. Rachel's unease about Hammond, coupled with her sudden disappearance, now seemed less like a coincidence. Hammond's pattern was becoming clear. Ortiz returned to the university, her mind buzzing with questions. She needed more evidence, something concrete to tie Hammond to the string of disappearances. Her gut told her that Rachel's body hadn't been found because it wasn't supposed to be found. But where had Hammond hidden the truth? Back at her desk, Ortiz combed through Hammond's records again, but this time, she dug deeper. There had to be a connection between him and the missing students. She felt it in her bones. Just when she was about to give up for the day, an email popped up on her screen. It was a forwarded message from Roger Hunt. Ortiz, I found something. Hammond's involvement in student disappearances goes back further than we thought. I've got a lead, but you need to move fast. Ortiz's pulse quickened. She opened the attachment. It was an old police report, one from a missing persons case in 1992. A student named Daniel Evans had vanished after a meeting with Hammond, and the file had been mysteriously closed. Ortiz's breath caught. This wasn't just about Lucas and Rachel. This was bigger. Hammond had been covering his tracks for years, and Ortiz had finally found the smoking gun. Ortiz wasted no time. She rushed to meet Roger Hunt at the archives, her heart racing. The report on Daniel Evans was a gold mine. It detailed how the student had been last seen in Hammond's office, upset over his grades, just like Rachel Turner had been. The report also noted that Hammond had been the last person to see him. But the most damning part was buried deep in the file, a handwritten note from one of Hammond's former colleagues. The note read, "There is a rumor going around that Professor Hammond has been involved in things we can't even begin to imagine. I hope this is just paranoia, but I've seen him too close to some of the students. I'm not sure he's who he says he is." Ortiz's stomach churned as she realized just how long Hammond's manipulations had been going on. She now had the smoking gun. But the question was, could she prove it before it was too late? Ortiz stood outside Hammond's office, the storm outside now matching the fury inside her. She had the evidence, but she knew Hammond would never go down without a fight. As she prepared to confront him once again, her phone rang. It was Roger. "Hammond's not at the university, Ortiz," Roger said, his voice urgent. "He's gone. The building's been cleared out. It's like he knew you were coming." Ortiz's blood ran cold. Hammond had made his move. Now, she had to find him before the truth was buried forever. Ortiz's heart raced as she stepped away from the university's empty halls. Hammond was gone, and the clock was ticking. She had to find him before he disappeared entirely. The realization that he was actively evading capture only deepened the mystery. Hammond was no longer just a professor, he was a fugitive, and with each passing minute, the trail grew colder. The phone call from Roger had only added more urgency to the case. Ortiz paced in front of her car, staring at the empty parking lot, her mind running in 1,000 directions. Hammond had covered his tracks meticulously. His office had been cleared out, nothing left behind. She had one lead left, the old police report she had uncovered. The missing student from 1992, Daniel Evans, had vanished under mysterious circumstances, much like Lucas and Rachel. There were too many similarities, too many connections between the disappearances for it all to be a coincidence. Ortiz knew Hammond wouldn't leave without a trace. He would have hidden something, somewhere. She had to go back to where it all started, the university archives. The archives were dimly lit and filled with rows of musty file cabinets. The air inside felt heavy, thick with the scent of old paper and forgotten memories. Ortiz had spent hours combing through records in the past few days, but this time she was looking for something more specific. She needed to find a connection between Hammond's past and the missing students. There had to be something hidden in plain sight. As she moved through the dusty files, Ortiz's eyes landed on a folder labeled 1992, Daniel Evans, Confidential. Her pulse quickened as she pulled it from the shelf and flipped it open. The first few pages were the standard missing person report, but then she found something that made her blood run cold, handwritten notes from Detective Mike Reynolds, the original investigator on the case. Hammond's name keeps coming up in conversations with students. Too many of them. Too much time spent one-on-one. Need to look closer. The notes were brief but pointed. Hammond had been on the radar even back then, and yet, nothing had been done. Reynolds had noted that Hammond was the last person to see Daniel Evans alive, but there were no further leads. The case had gone cold just like the others. Ortiz sat back in the chair, the weight of what she had found pressing on her chest. Hammond hadn't just been a teacher, he had been carefully orchestrating this for years. He was not just a predator of students, he was a manipulator, and his web of lies stretched back decades. As Ortiz absorbed the significance of the documents, her phone buzzed. It was Roger. Ortiz, you need to get over here, now. We found something. It's connected to Hammond's past. Something big. Ortiz's stomach flipped. She grabbed her jacket and headed for the door. Roger met Ortiz outside the archives, his expression tense. I don't like this, Lena. I really don't. What did you find? Ortiz asked, her voice low and urgent. Roger handed her a folder, the familiar official seal of the university on the cover. I did some digging into Hammond's background, and it turns out he's not who he claims to be. In fact, he's been using a fake identity for years. Ortiz flipped through the papers. The documents showed that Hammond's past was fabricated, with gaps in his history stretching all the way back to his college days. He had assumed the name Elliot Hammond after a failed career in a different city, one that had been wiped clean of any records. What she found was a different name, tied to a string of oddities, documents that didn't match his supposed history. Someone covered up his past, Ortiz said, piecing it together. This goes beyond just manipulation. Hammond has been living under a false identity for years. Roger nodded. And there's more. We traced his real name back to a small town called Brixton. There were rumors there of a teacher who was involved in a disappearance, a student who was found dead. It was covered up, just like everything else. Ortiz's mind was spinning. So Hammond was involved in this before? And now he's here, doing it again? We need to find him, Lena, Roger said. We can't wait any longer. Ortiz clenched her fists. This was the moment she had been dreading, the realization that Hammond's crimes stretched further than she could have imagined. He wasn't just a dangerous man, he was a serial manipulator, and she had to stop him before he could destroy another life. Ortiz immediately made plans to leave for Brixton, the small town where Hammond had disappeared from years ago. It was a long shot, but she had to follow the trail. Hammond had been careful, too careful. But now, there were cracks she was determined to exploit. The drive to Brixton took hours, the rain pounding against the windshield, the road winding through dense forests and small towns. As Ortiz approached Brixton, a cold unease settled in her stomach. This town held the answers. This was where it had all started, where Hammond's true identity had been buried. She arrived at Brixton's local police station, which seemed oddly quiet for a town with such a dark history. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The officers were reluctant to speak with her, but Ortiz wasn't about to back down. She introduced herself, showing her badge, and within minutes, the officer on duty handed her a dusty folder. It was the case of Sarah Finch, a 17-year-old student who had gone missing in 1990. The file was thick with redacted sections, but one thing stood out: Professor Hammond was listed as a suspect in her disappearance. The case had never been solved, and Sarah Finch had never been found. Ortiz's pulse quickened. She had stumbled onto something much bigger than she expected. The case of Sarah Finch had never been closed, and now it was the key to everything. As Ortiz sat at the small table in the station, flipping through the old case files, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Roger. "Lena, you're not going to believe this. Hammond's been spotted at an old house on the outskirts of Brixton. We need to move fast." Ortiz's heart raced. The hunt was on, and she was closer than ever to uncovering the truth. Hammond was still out there, and this time, she was going to bring him down. The sound of the rain intensified as Detective Ortiz raced toward the outskirts of Brixton. Her headlights cut through the darkness, casting long shadows against the slick roads. Every instinct told her that she was close. She had uncovered the threads of Hammond's past, and now it was time to confront him. The file on Sarah Finch, the 17-year-old who had gone missing years ago, was more than just another clue. It was the smoking gun that connected everything. Ortiz's heart pounded as she recalled the image of Sarah's face from the file. She was young, hopeful, and full of potential, just like Lucas and Rachel. But Hammond had taken that hope away from her. The truth she had been seeking was finally within reach, but it was also dangerously close to the edge. If Hammond was behind Sarah's disappearance, the evidence could change everything. She had to be ready for whatever she would find in that old house. The house was nestled at the edge of town, on a hill that overlooked a dense thicket of trees. It looked abandoned, but Ortiz knew better. Hammond had been hiding in plain sight, and this house, this decaying, eerie place, was his refuge. Ortiz parked her car at a safe distance, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon and the distant city lights. The air felt thick with tension, every step toward the house weighing heavily on her. She could feel the rush of adrenaline coursing through her veins as she approached the front door. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. The house smelled of dust and mildew, a stark contrast to the antiseptic feel of Hammond's office. Ortiz stepped inside cautiously, her hand gripping the gun at her side. The walls were lined with old furniture and scattered papers, some of which had long been yellowed with age. Everything about the house was in disarray, as if it had been abandoned for years. But Ortiz knew better. Hammond had been here, living in the shadows, hiding his dark secrets. She moved carefully through the house, her senses heightened, her every instinct telling her that this was it, that the truth was just around the corner. The silence was suffocating, the only sound being the soft echo of her footsteps on the wooden floors. At the end of a long hallway, she saw a door that appeared to lead to a basement. It was slightly ajar. Without hesitation, Ortiz approached, her hand tightening around her flashlight. She shone the beam into the darkness, revealing a set of stairs that led down into a cold, oppressive space. Ortiz's stomach churned. The basement felt like a tomb, a place where secrets were buried, never to see the light of day. But today, those secrets would be exposed. With a deep breath, she descended into the basement, her flashlight illuminating the walls covered in old photographs, papers, and strange diagrams that made her heart race. Some of the pictures were familiar, faces she had seen in the missing persons reports. And in the center of the room was a desk, its surface cluttered with files and maps of the university. Ortiz's eyes narrowed as she approached the desk. There, in the center, was a large file folder. She hesitated for a moment and opened it. Inside were photographs of Lucas Carter, Rachel Turner, and Sarah Finch, all of them. The images were printed in black and white, and under each, there was a single word, property. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. Hammond hadn't just been a teacher. He had been controlling these students, manipulating them, and using them as part of something far darker, a twisted game. The truth about what he had done to them was clearer now than ever before. Ortiz's breath caught in her throat as she flipped through the file. Each page revealed more disturbing details about Hammond's involvement with his students, and the depth of his manipulation became horrifyingly clear. There were notes about their weaknesses, their fears, and the ways Hammond had preyed on them. What was worse was the realization that Hammond had been keeping track of each of his victims in a sickening way. His influence had spread further than Ortiz could have imagined. But as Ortiz reached the final pages of the file, something caught her eye, one final note. It was a list of locations, written in Hammond's precise handwriting. The first location was a rundown area near the university, a site she had passed many times without giving it a second thought. But the second location was something different. It was an old, forgotten warehouse on the outskirts of town, far removed from the university and any place she had ever searched. Ortiz's heart pounded as she realized this was where Hammond had hidden the final piece of the puzzle. This warehouse, wherever it was the key to finding the last of Hammond's victims, Lucas Carter. Ortiz quickly gathered the file, tucking it under her arm, and made her way back upstairs. But as she reached the door, a sound echoed through the house, a faint creak, followed by a low whisper. It was Hammond. He was here. Ortiz froze, her pulse quickening. She hadn't expected him to still be around, but there he was, standing at the end of the hallway. The dim light from the basement cast long, eerie shadows across his face, and for the first time, Ortiz saw him as he truly was, an old man consumed by guilt, fear, and madness. Hammond didn't speak at first. He simply stared at Ortiz, his eyes wide with terror. She could see the cracks in his calm exterior, the fear that now gripped him as tightly as he had once gripped his students. "You've come too far," Hammond finally said, his voice hoarse. "You'll never find them. You'll never find the truth." Ortiz stepped forward, her voice steady. "You're done, Hammond. I know what you did. I know what you're hiding. It's over." For the first time, Hammond's composure faltered. His shoulders sagged, and he looked as if he might collapse under the weight of his own guilt. "I tried to stop it," he whispered. "I tried to make it right, but it was too late." Ortiz's eyes narrowed. "Make it right? You've ruined lives, Hammond. You've destroyed everything. You can't make it right." Hammond's expression darkened. It was never about them. It was about control. They never understood. They were all just pawns. Ortiz stepped forward, her hand firmly grasping her weapon. "Tell me where Lucas is. Tell me where he's been hidden." Hammond's lips trembled as he looked down at the ground. "The warehouse," he muttered. "That's where it all ends. That's where I kept them. All of them." Ortiz's breath caught. This was it. The location she had been searching for. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the place where everything would be revealed. But Hammond wasn't finished. He took a step back, his voice shaking as he spoke one last word. "You're too late." The door behind him slammed open. Ortiz spun around, her gun raised, ready for whatever came next. A figure stood in the doorway, a silhouette, dark and menacing, blocking the light from the hallway. Hammond's eyes widened in terror. The figure stepped forward, and Ortiz's heart skipped a beat as the face came into view. It wasn't Hammond who had spoken last. It was someone else. Someone she never expected.